My name is Michael Human. I am the translator of the Iliad and the Odyssey. These two books are available on Amazon right now. There's a link in the description. A lot of people have been asking me for my opinion on Christopher Nolan's new film. So here are some thoughts I have on it. Number one, first and foremost, I thought the film was great. I think it was very well made, very well acted. I love the approach that he took with the no CGI sort of thing, or minimalized CGI, and practical effects, and that I thought that was lots of fun. It's well-made film. Now, is it Homer's Odyssey? No, it absolutely is not Homer's Odyssey. But the Odyssey has been adapted more than almost any other story by people for thousands of years. Literally, have been redoing the Odyssey from this. The playwrights back in Greece were retelling the story over and over again in plays. And in song and everything else. So you know, adaptation is something very familiar to the Odyssey as a story from this. He took a lot of the elements of the story. He took, you know, the most important elements, and he compressed a lot of things down. And he modified things in ways that, you know, you have to do to kind of tell a story in a couple of hours. You know, when ancient rhapsodes, bards, would retell the story of the Odyssey and recount it, it would take days to get through. So, you know, you can't have everything in there. Some of the changes I thought were unusual, interesting. I think most of them had justification, though. I think so. I think the biggest change that he made to the story was the role of Calypso, and that's played by Charlize Theron in the book. In Homer's Odyssey, Calypso is a very minor figure, appears around book 5 and 6 or so, and disappears after that. She's the one that keeps Odysseus prisoner on her island, and it's very much, she is the, you know, keep it in prisoner. And that's it. Odysseus is not allowed to leave the island until Athena finally gets permission from Zeus to let him go, and then they kind of force Calypso to let him go, and all this. Nolan made a big change to the story there. He made Calypso essentially a therapist, because I think at the heart of it, I think what Nolan was trying to do was he's saying, okay, let's take this story, this ancient story from 3,000 years ago, and let's focus on the things that audiences today would understand and relate to in a way. And I think the one big thing that comes throughout the story, and I think it was a good idea for him to kind of focus on this, even though it has nothing really to do with Homer's Odyssey, is the idea of post-traumatic stress. Odysseus as a character is really strange in storytelling. He is incredibly smart, smarter than everybody else, but he's also the luckiest person on the face of the earth. Everything bad happens to him, but he survives everything. So he went through ordeal after ordeal after ordeal in his journeys, and he's the only one who survived. Of all the people who left with him from Ithaca to go to fight in the Trojan War, he's the only one that returns. And that survivor guilt is kind of at the heart of Nolan's Odyssey. Coming to terms with the fact that all the people that were surrounded you died, and coming to terms with the things you had to do to survive, to get through those things, to get back home. That becomes sort of the central thrust, I think, of the film, and that's where Charlize Theron's character Calypso comes into play. She essentially walks him through him regaining the memories that he apparently had lost of all the adventures he has from this. In Homer's Odyssey, none of that happens. He actually retells his story to on a different island, the island of the Phaeacians, where he essentially tells the story that's of his adventures to them, in part to kind of share it with the audience, but also in part as a way to get them on his side so he can actually get home. They're the ones that finally allow him to get back to Ithaca. It's not sort of a, get on a raft and float until suddenly you're there. That part was kind of weird. I don't know what's going on with that, but anyways, the whole part with Calypso is kind of at the heart of the entire film, and it's completely different. It has nothing to do with what Homer does, but it's very much in keeping with a modern audience, because essentially a story like an epic story like the Odyssey is a very externalized story. It's not one where you're delving too deeply into the characters' minds. But modern audiences expect to understand, to go into the minds of your characters, and to really kind of delve into there. And that's really what, at the heart of it, that's kind of what was going on with our Odysseus in this film from there. Another thing that I think that Nolan did a really good job with was the idea of Zeus's law. That's what it's called in the novel. Sorry, that's what it's called in the film. In Homer, it's referred to, it's a concept called Xenia, which is a fundamental concept to the ancient world, to Bronze Age culture, which is a guest-host relationship. The idea being that if you travel away from home and you meet people there, they will be a good host to you. You can almost guarantee that they will be a good host to you, provided you're a guest for them. And so you become friends with people in other parts of the world. You gain allies there, and that helps reciprocate trade. That helps better understand people. That helps you, when you go to a foreign place, to help navigate around because you have an ally on your side. It had a lot of positive elements related to it. It's so positive, in fact, that if you visited a place in your lifetime, then your children and their children would also still be considered honored guests at that place if they ever travel to this place. And similarly, if the people you stay with in one place come to visit you, then you treat them exactly the same way. So it was a very important part of everyday life in the ancient world. The one thing that I think Nolan didn't get right about that was that he focused entirely upon the idea of a good host, and kind of discounted the idea of a bad guest. The Trojan War was started because Paris of Troy was a bad guest. He took the host's wife and fled back to Troy, and that's what started the Trojan War, because Menelaus and his brother Agamemnon then raised an army to try to get Helen back from this. Similarly, in the Odyssey, throughout Homer's story, there are numerous occasions where the suitors are all kind of told, you are a bad guest. You are breaking Zeus's law, and Zeus will punish you. It's said again and again and again, and there's always like little hints of echoes of omens, and like the thunderclaps and things like that. A bird flying on the right side or something like that. So the audience, reading the story or hearing the story back thousands of years ago, would know for sure that the suitors are in the wrong here, and Odysseus is 100% in the right when he comes back and gets his vengeance on him from this. The focus, though, was not on the suitors being wrong. The suitors were bad, and I don't think there's any question about that. But the focus was so heavily placed upon Odysseus being a bad host at the end of the story, that so I don't want to go into spoilers, but it kind of refocuses the story to make Odysseus essentially guilty of punishing the people who had invaded his home, and basically left them broke and penniless there. Not really, but basically ate him out of house and home. Which is what the story is all about in Homer from this. So I think that was a little distant, but at its heart, though, I think that concept, the Xenia concept, and having that as a central figure element of the story, I thought was a really good thing. The last thing I want to mention is a little simple thing. There's many references to sea peoples in the story. There's a conversation between Telemachus and Penelope early on where they talk about the invaders from the sea, and I think the word sea peoples actually does show up several times in the story. That's an interesting, it has nothing to do with Homer, but it has everything to do with that period in time when the story was told. So we think Homer probably wrote the story down, or whoever Homer was wrote the story down probably sometime around 700 BC, somewhere around there. 750, 700 BC, around there. But the story itself is much older than that, several hundreds and hundreds of years older. It comes before the Greek Dark Ages, and it comes it goes back as far, we think, as the end of the Bronze Age. And Eric Klein, the historian, states that the Bronze Age ended in 1177 BC, when all of the major powers in the Mediterranean, that includes Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, who were the Greeks, and many other groups, all essentially collapsed. The Egyptians didn't collapse, but they became a shell of what they once were after this. They're the only ones that survive, and where writing survived. Writing essentially dies out in all the other areas in the Mediterranean area, and it doesn't return until around 700 when Homer's writing from this. So the fact that they're mentioning sea peoples here is a really interesting thing, I thought, that they would throw in there, because it kind of hints at the Bronze Age collapse that is to come. And the story of the Trojan War is essentially kind of the final story in all of the sagas from the heroic age of ancient Greece. And these are the stories that kind of kept people going, kept people interested for those 500 years in between the end of the Bronze Age and the start of what they call the Archaic period in ancient Greece, which happened around the time when Homer was writing and Hesiod from this. I thought it was kind of an interesting addition to the story. It has nothing necessarily to do with the story itself, but it does kind of place the story in a particular historical time frame, which is fairly accurate, at least as far as what we know. So those are my thoughts about it. I hope you found the video interesting. I have links as I said before, to my translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And if you're interested, check them out. Otherwise, have a great day, everyone. See you later.